Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Rabta Forum International Digital TV. I'm Bisma Mirza, and today I'll be sharing with you another article. This article is written by Arundhati Roy, and it is titled as The Illusion of a U.S.-India Partnership. Arundhati Roy shares her opinion on Narendra Modi's visit to United States, and it was published on July 14, 2023 in the New York Times. And she states, the state visit by Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India to Washington last month was billed as a meeting of two of the world's greatest democracies, and the countries duly declared themselves among the closest partners in the world. To that, she poses questions, and her first question is, but what sort of partners will they be? What sort of partners can they be? She further writes, President Biden claims that the defense of democracy is the central tenet of his administration. She remarks, that's commendable. But what happened in Washington was the exact opposite. The man Americans openly fawned over has systematically undermined India's democracy. She further writes, we need not be shocked by America's choice of friends. The enchanting folks that United States government has cultivated as partners include the Shah of Iran, General Muhammad Ziaul Haq of Pakistan, the Afghan Mujahideen, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, a series of tin pot dictators in South Vietnam, and General Augusto Pinochet of Chile. She further writes, a central tenet of United States foreign policy has too often been democracy for United States, dictatorship for its non-white friends. She writes, Mr. Modi certainly does not belong in the rogues gallery. India is bigger than him. It will see him off. The question is when and at what cost. She writes, India is not a dictatorship, but neither is it still a democracy. Mr. Modi heads a majoritarian Hindu supremacist electoral autocracy that has tightened its grip on one of the most diverse countries in the world. I'll repeat this. India is not a dictatorship, but neither is it still a democracy. Mr. Modi heads a majoritarian Hindu supremacist electoral autocracy that is tightening its grip on one of the most diverse countries in the world. This makes election season, which is just around the corner, our most dangerous time. It's murder season. The partner that the United States government is cultivating and empowering is one of the most dangerous people in the world. Dangerous not as a person, but as someone turning the world's most populous country into a tinderbox. What kind of a democrat is a prime minister who almost never holds a news conference? She asked. It took all of the U.S. government's powers of persuasion, such as they are, to coax Mr. Modi into addressing one while in Washington. He had agreed to take two questions, only one of them from a United States journalist, Sabrina Siddiqui. The Wall Street Journal's White House reporter stood up to ask him what his government was doing to prevent discrimination against minorities, particularly Muslims, given the worsening abuses against Muslims and Christians in his country. It is a question that really ought to have been raised by the White House. But the Biden administration outsourced it to a journalist. In India, we held our breath, she writes. She further writes, Mr. Modi expressed surprise that such a question should be asked at all. Then he laid out all the bromide that he had brought along in his baggage, and she quotes him, "Democracy is our spirit. Democracy runs in our veins. We live democracy," he added. "That's absolute. There is absolute no discrimination," and so on. In India, the mainstream media, she writes after that, in India, the mainstream media and Mr. Modi's vast fan base reacted as though he had hit the ball clean out of the park. Those who oppose him were left sorting through the debris of shreds of reassurance. Did you notice, in inverted, in the brackets, she writes, did you notice Biden's body language? Totally hostile and so on. Bracket close. I was grateful for the hypocrisy. Imagine if Modi had felt confident enough to tell the truth. Hypocrisy gives us a sort of raged, shabby shelter. For now, it's all we have. Then she further adds, mercilessly attacked by the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party's cheerleaders and other Hindu nationalists on Twitter, Ms. Siddiqui was accused of being a biased Pakistani Islamist hate monger with an anti-India agenda. There were more polite comments. Those were the more polite comments. Eventually, the White House had to step up and condemn the harassment as antithetical to the very principles of democracy. It felt as if everything that the White House had sought to gloss over had become embarrassingly manifest. Ms. Siddiqui may not have anticipated what she walked into. The same cannot be said of the State Department and the White House. They would have known plenty about the man for whom they were rolling out the red carpet. She writes further, they would have known about the role Mr. Modi is accused of having played in the 2002 anti-Muslim program in the state of Gujarat, in which more than 1,000 Muslims were killed. They would have known about the sickening regularity with which Muslims are being publicly lynched, about a member of Mr. Modi's cabinet meeting some lynchers with garlands, and about the precipitous process of Muslim segregation and ghettoization. They would have known about the hounding of oppositions, politicians, students, human rights activists, lawyers, and journalists, some of whom have received long prison sentences. But the attack have received long prison sentences. The attack on universities by the police and people suspected of being Hindu nationalist, the rewriting of history textbooks, the banning of films, the shutdown of Amnesty International India, the raid on the Indian offices of the BBC, the activists, journalists, and government critics being placed on mysterious no-fly list, and the pressures on academics, both Indian and foreign. They would have known that India now ranks 161st out of 180 countries in the World Press Freedom Index. That many of the best Indian journalists have been hounded out of the mainstream media, and that journalists would soon be subjected to a censorial regulatory regime in which a government appointed body will have the power to decide whether media reports and commentary about the government are fake or misleading. She further continues about what they would have known, and she writes that they would have known about the situation in Kashmir, which beginning in 2019 was subjected to a months-long communication blackout, the longest internet shutdown in a democracy, and whose journalists suffer harassment, arrest, and interrogation. Nobody, she writes, in the 21st century should have to live as they do, with a boot on their throats. Writes that they would have known about the Citizenship Amendment Act passed in 2019, which barefacedly discriminates against Muslims, the massive protests that it touched off, and how those protests ended only after dozens of Muslims were killed the following year by Hindu mobs in Delhi, which incidentally took place while President Donald Trump was in town on a state visit, and about which he uttered not a word. The list, she adds on to the list, and she says they might have known that at the same time they were petting Mr. Modi, Muslims were fleeing a small town in northern India after Hindu extremists affiliated with the Bharatiya Janata Party reportedly marked X on their doors and told them to leave. She writes, "It's time we retired that stupid adage about speaking truth to power. Power knows the truth far better than we do." In addition to everything else, the Biden administration would have also known that one of the very moment of the grand reception, and every episode of bogus flattery will be spun into pure gold for Mr. Modi's 2024 election campaign, in which he is seeking a third term. Ironically, she writes that Mr. Modi had openly campaigned for Mr. Trump in 2019 at a huge gathering of the Indian diaspora in a Texas stadium attended by Mr. Trump. She writes, Mr. Modi revved up the crowd shouting, "Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar." Once more for a Trump government. Still, she writes, Mr. Biden pulled out all the stops for this most polarized figure in the history of modern Indian politics. And she asks, why? In an interview with Christiane Amanpour that aired on CNN during the state visit, and it's tempting to believe that this too was a piece of White House outsourcing. She writes, President Barack Obama told us why. He was asked how a US president should deal with leaders like Mr. Modi, who are widely considered autocratic and illiberal. She now mentioned the reply of Barack Obama. She writes, "It's complicated," he said, mentioning the financial, geopolitical, and security concerns that any American president must consider. To those of us listening in India, what came through was simply, "It's China, stupid." Mr. Obama added that if minorities are not protected, India would at some point start pulling apart. The trolls in India went to work on him, but these words were a balm to many in India who are paying a hard price for standing up to Hindu nationalism and have been shocked by how Mr. Biden has moved to strengthen Mr. Modi's hand. He writes, but if the President of the United States is allowed to consider national self-interest in his dealings with other countries, she says that courtesy must be extended to other countries too. So what kind of an ally can India be to the United States? She now elaborates on that. Washington's top envoy to East Asia has said the United States military expects India to help it patrol the South China Sea, where the atmosphere has thickened with tension over China's territorial claims. She writes, so far India is playing along, but will it really risk putting skin in this game? India's ties with Russia and China are deep, wide and old. An estimated 90% of India's army equipment and around 70% of its air force equipment, including fighter jets, are of Russian origin. She further adds, with 2.2 million barrels a day in June and in open defense of US-led sanctions on Russia, India is among the biggest importers of Russian crude oil, some of which it refines and sells overseas, including to Europe and the United States. Not surprisingly, Mr. Modi has kept India neutral on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Nor can he truly stand up to China, which is India's biggest source of imports. She writes, India is no match for China, not economically, not militarily. For years, China has occupied thousands of square miles of land in Ladakh, in the Himalayas, which India considers its sovereign territory. She writes, Chinese troops are camped on it. Bridges, roads, and other infrastructure are being built to connect it with China. Banning, she writes, other than banning TikTok, Mr. Modi's government has responded with timidity and denial. She asks, what kind of an ally will the United States be to India in the event of a confrontation with China? The United States, she writes, is far from the potential battlefield. The only price it might pay if things go badly is a bloody nose and a last helicopter ride out of the war zone as collaborators hung on its landing skids. We need only look around our neighborhood at the fate of America's old friends, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now she ends it in the following words: a bad moon is rising in the South China Sea. But for India, its friends and enemies are all wrapped up together in a tight ball of wax. She says, we should be exceedingly, exceptionally, extraordinarily careful where we place our feet and float our boats. Everybody should. This was the opinion of Arundhati Roy on the visit of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to United States. Arundhati Roy, she is an author and she also writes, she's an author with novels including The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, and her recent work is the essay compilation collection of Azadi, Freedom, Pessimism, Fiction. You do share your opinion in the comment section and do let us know if what you feel about her opinion and generally what you do feel about the visit of Indian Prime Minister to the United States. I'm Bisma Mirza and I'm signing off, and I'll be back with another interesting article and will share that perspective with you. Thank you very much. Take care. Allah Hafiz.